As I sat in the dark, gripping my phone, I replayed the video for the 10th time that night. There she was, my wife, laughing, dancing, and kissing another man in plain sight, as if the vows we made didn't exist. My chest burned with betrayal, anger, and a craving for justice. But before I could confront her, fate delivered its own twist. Karma struck in a way I never saw coming, leaving me stunned and questioning everything. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next one. In the dim light of a desk lamp, Marty sat hunched over on an old leather couch, his laptop precariously perched on the armrest. The soft hum of the central heating blended with the rhythmic clicks of his mouse, while the cold December wind howled outside the window. On the screen, a YouTube video played, a highlight reel of Larry Big L Johnson, a basketball legend and Marty's old college acquaintance. Larry, standing 6 feet tall and blonde with flowing blonde hair tied back, had once been the star of their shared campus. Marty remembered those brief yet friendly interactions when life was simpler. Now, Larry had become a famous game host, but Marty still followed his journey with a mix of pride and wistful envy. Scrolling through YouTube's recommendations, Marty's attention was caught by a video titled, "Big L's Wild Night in Miami? Another Conquest?" The thumbnail showed Larry dancing with a stunning blonde woman. Curiosity piqued. Marty clicked. Tucked it away in his lap. Lee opened a shaky phone footage in a crowded nightclub, flashing strobe lights and thumping bass. Larry moved confidently on the dance floor, laughing with his arm around the woman. Lee, Marty's wife. The footage was damning, their intimate gestures, synchronized movements, and the unmistakable kiss that left no room for doubt. The clip ended with the headline, "Big L scores again." Marty froze, the room suddenly feeling as cold as the wind outside. Staring at the screen, disbelief turned to anguish. With trembling hands, he hit replay, bracing himself to relive the pain once more. Marty's fingers trembled as he replayed the clip, his breath catching in his throat. The video started again, each frame feeling sharper, more vivid, as if the screen itself was mocking him. The rhythmic pulse of the nightclub's music felt deafening now, the thud of the bass matching the rapid pounding in his chest. There she was, laughing with abandon, her blonde hair catching the neon lights, her body pressed far too close to Larry's. His eyes fixed on every detail. The way Larry's hand rested possessively on Lee's lower back. The way she leaned into him with a familiarity that felt like a punch to the gut. Marty tried to convince himself it couldn't be true, that maybe the angle of the camera exaggerated their closeness. But then came the kiss. A moment that shattered all illusions. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably passionate. His wife, kissing another man, kissing Larry. A hot wave of anger surged through him, burning away the initial numbness. He slammed the laptop shut, the sound cutting through the silence of the room like a whip. For a brief moment, he stared at the blank screen, his reflection barely visible in the dim light. He didn't recognize the man staring back, his face flushed, jaw clenched so tight it ached. The questions hit him all at once, like an avalanche. How long had this been going on? Was it just Miami, or had there been others? Did she think he was a fool? The betrayal felt physical, like a knife twisting in his chest, and with it came an overwhelming sense of humiliation. He imagined the co-workers at Lee's conference. Had they been whispering about her? About him? The man too blind to see what was happening right in front of him? Marty stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. His mind raced, but every thought looped back to the same crushing reality. He replayed the past weeks in his head, searching for signs he might have missed. He'd kissed her goodbye at the airport, joked about her bringing back Miami souvenirs. Had she been laughing at him then, already planning this betrayal? Or worse, had Larry always been in her thoughts, a dormant fantasy brought to life the moment she saw him? He reached for his phone, desperate for answers, dialing Lee's number without even realizing it. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he dropped the phone onto the couch, his hand shaking with barely contained fury. Needing clarity, he scrolled back to the video's timestamp. It had been posted less than an hour ago. This wasn't some distant mistake. It was unfolding in real time. She was supposed to be at a business dinner, attending a conference with her advertising firm. Yet there she was, dancing in a nightclub, her loyalty discarded as easily as the vows they'd made. Marty's thoughts darkened, spiraling deeper into a pit of rage and despair. The man he'd admired, the larger-than-life Larry, had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and Lee, his partner of nearly 2 decades, had been complicit in the ultimate betrayal. As the cold reality of the situation set in, Marty's anger crystallized into a single, resolute thought. This ends now. And with that, he picked up his phone again, this time calling Bart. There would be no more doubt, no more hesitation. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Marty stared at the phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the replay button one last time. Against his better judgment, he let the video roll again. Every second felt like a stab to his pride and his heart. The shaky footage zoomed in too close, catching every damning detail. The flush on Lee's cheeks as she danced, her wide, carefree smile as Larry whispered something in her ear, the way her fingers curled around his shoulder as though they belonged there. The kiss was the worst part, slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of shame. There was no mistaking what he was seeing. Lee wasn't drunk or caught up in some moment of innocent fun. This was intentional, intimate. Marty clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. He paused the video at the moment their lips met, the image frozen like a painting of betrayal. Breathing heavily, he shoved the laptop off his lap and onto the coffee table. His hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a storm of anger and humiliation that churned in his chest. He grabbed his phone, opened the YouTube app, and downloaded the clip. If Lee dared to deny it, he would have proof. His finger hovered over her name in his contact list for a moment before he pressed call. The line rang, the sound grating against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. He cursed under his breath and called again, his frustration mounting. The voicemail picked up, and he didn't bother leaving a message. Instead, he sent a short text. "Call me, now." Marty threw the phone onto the couch, running his hands through his hair as he paced the room. His mind raced with unanswered questions. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had she lied to him before? And why Larry, of all people? Someone he knew, someone he had once admired. Grabbing his phone again, he scrolled through his contacts and stopped at Bart's name. Bart had been a close friend since college and was also attending the conference in Miami. If anyone would know what was really going on, it was him. Marty hit call and held his breath as the line connected. "Hello." Bart's voice was casual, but there was a hesitation that Marty caught immediately. "Bart, it's Marty," he said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "Do you know where Lee is right now?" As we were passing the guest house, there was a long pause on the other end. When Bart finally spoke, his tone was cautious. "Marty, look man, this is bad." Marty felt his stomach drop. "So she's with Larry," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. Bart sighed heavily, his voice tinged with regret. Yeah. She's been spending a lot of time with him since we got here. Everyone's noticed. After Tuesday night, they were inseparable." "Oof," Bart sighed. "And he wants an excuse to bury their head in their work. Everyone has noticed this lately." Marty swallowed hard, his grip on the phone tightening. "Inseparable? What do you mean?" "Be specific, Bart." "Man, they've been together every night," Bart admitted reluctantly. "She hasn't been at the group dinners, and her roommate says she's not even sleeping in her room. We all assumed she was with him, and now, well, the video's all over YouTube. By morning, everyone's going to see it." Marty closed his eyes, leaning against the wall as the weight of Bart's words hit him. "Do you know if she's been sleeping with him?" Bart hesitated, then sighed. "We don't know for sure, but yeah, probably. They'd been acting like they're the only 2 people in the world." Marty's jaw tightened. "Thanks for being honest, Bart," he said after a long pause. "Can you do me one favor?" The bat slowly shook his head. "Of course. If you see her before her flight tomorrow, tell her not to bother coming home. I'll handle it from there." There was another pause before Bart replied, "I'm sorry, Marty. I really am." "Me too," Marty said quietly, ending the call. He stared at the phone in his hand, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper. His marriage, his trust, his family, everything was crumbling. And now, he had to figure out what to do next. When Marty reflected on his college years, he still vividly remembered the first time he met Lee. It was the first day of their penultimate year in college, in a math class most students dreaded. The classroom was sparsely filled, with a scattering of shy, reserved faces across the rows. But there she was, sitting alone by the window, her blonde hair shimmering in the morning sunlight. Lee was absent-mindedly doodling in her notebook, seemingly oblivious to the attention she commanded. Marty, confident but not arrogant, chose the seat next to her. She glanced up and smiled, a smile that was both alluring and challenging. "Looks like someone was smart enough to take this seat," she teased. "Or maybe I'm just immune to bad smells," Marty replied with a smirk, leaning in slightly for effect. Her laugh was melodic, genuine, and full of life. He knew he had made an impression. In the following weeks, Marty and Lee began talking more often. They chatted before class and occasionally walked to the student union together. Marty found Lee captivating, her sharp intellect, ambition, and effortless charm. But there was one obstacle: Rashad. Rashad, Lee's boyfriend, was no ordinary rival. A hockey player with a strong build and natural charisma, he radiated confidence without being overbearing. At 5'8" and a lean 220 pounds, Rashad was the kind of person who drew attention effortlessly. Marty met him during a study session when Lee introduced them. Rashad's handshake was firm, his smile genuine, but there was an unspoken message beneath it. "I know you're interested in her, and she's mine." Despite Rashad, Marty couldn't stop thinking about Lee. They shared a natural connection that deepened with every conversation. Their study sessions evolved into longer talks, drifting from math to life, dreams, and ambitions. Marty respected Rashad. He was intelligent and passionate about his goals, but Marty couldn't ignore the cracks in their relationship. Lee occasionally mentioned Rashad's demanding hockey schedule, the time they spent apart, and subtle hints of dissatisfaction. The turning point came during a bridge tournament Lee invited Marty to join. Paired as partners, they quickly found their rhythm, their easy banter carrying them to an impressive third-place finish. Rashad, watching from the sidelines, appeared unfazed, but Marty caught a fleeting expression on his face. Possessiveness or perhaps insecurity. It was brief but unmistakable. Meanwhile, Stephanie, Marty's neighbor, entered the picture. Stunning and outgoing, she had her own complicated dynamic with Rashad, often crossing paths with him outside of Marty's awareness. Though nothing seemed obvious at the time, Marty couldn't shake the feeling that their web of connections was more tangled than it appeared. Looking back, Marty realized those moments were the seeds of something greater, small signs of the betrayal that would one day shatter the life he and Lee had built. At the time, they were just young students, navigating the complexities of youth, love, and ambition. But even then, the fault lines were forming, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The midday sun cast long shadows on the neatly mowed lawn as Lee stepped out of the taxi. She hesitated for a moment, gripping the handle of her suitcase, her eyes scanning the familiar house. The front door, usually a symbol of comfort and belonging, now felt like a barrier between her and the life she feared was slipping away. She took a deep breath and walked up the driveway. But when she reached for the keypad, the code didn't work. Fantasy, she tried again, her fingers shaking. Nothing. Frustration mixed with panic as she rang the doorbell repeatedly, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. A few houses away, Mrs. Cunningham, the elderly neighbor, peeked through her curtains, her sharp eyes catching every movement. The door finally opened, and Marty stood there, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. His jaw was set, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth it once held for her. "I came home," Lee replied softly, her voice trembling. She dropped her suitcase and stepped forward, but Marty didn't move to let her in. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. "This isn't your home anymore," he said sharply. His words hit her like a slap, and she staggered back slightly, her eyes widening in shock. "Marty, please," she began, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up, but we can talk about this." Talk?" Marty interrupted, his voice rising. "Talk about what, Lee? About how you humiliated me in front of the entire world? About how you threw away our family for 3 nights of that?" He gestured vaguely, his tone dripping with disgust. "I made a mistake," she pleaded, her hands clasped in desperation. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer, her voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking, Marty. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Marty barked, his laugh bitter and hollow. "It meant enough for you to destroy everything we built together. It meant enough for you to make me a joke in front of my friends, our neighbors, and our kids." Lee sank to her knees on the lawn, her sobs echoing through the quiet street. By now, Mrs. Cunningham had stepped onto her porch, pretending to water her plants, but watching intently. Another neighbor, Mr. Ellis, paused while taking out the trash, glancing toward the commotion. "Glory be to Marty," Lee said through her tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I love you. Please, don't do this. Don't give up on us." Marty's expression hardened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of pain. "Love?" he spat. "If this is your idea of love, then I don't want it. Your things are in the garage. That's as close to this house as you'll ever get again." Lee's sobs grew louder, but Marty refused to waver. Mrs. Cunningham finally approached, her soft voice cutting through the tension. "Lee, dear, why don't you come inside my house for a while?" she offered, placing a gentle hand on Lee's shoulder. Lee glanced up at Marty one last time, searching his face for any sign of forgiveness, but his gaze was unyielding, his anger as immovable as stone. Realizing she had no choice, she stood shakily and allowed Mrs. Cunningham to lead her away. As Marty closed the door behind him, he leaned against it, his chest heaving. Through the blinds, he watched Lee disappear into the neighbor's house. He didn't feel victorious. Instead, an overwhelming wave of emptiness washed over him, leaving him more alone than ever. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Marty stood motionless in the living room, staring at the closed door as if willing the chaos outside to vanish. His hands were clenched into fists, knuckles white with tension. The confrontation with Lee replayed in his mind like a broken record, each word they exchanged scraping against his nerves. His chest felt tight, a knot of rage and anguish twisting painfully within him. He couldn't stay still. The anger was too much, a wildfire roaring through his veins. With a sudden, guttural growl, Marty stormed down the stairs to the basement. The room was dimly lit, cluttered with remnants of old hobbies and half-finished projects, but in the center stood his salvation, the heavy bag. It swayed gently in the still air, waiting silently for him. Without hesitation, Marty grabbed a pair of gloves from the shelf, but as he slipped them on, he realized they were unnecessary. He yanked them off and let them drop to the floor. This wasn't about technique or safety. This was about release. He positioned himself in front of the bag, shoulders tense, fists trembling. The first punch landed hard, the dull thud reverberating through the room. Then another, and another. Each strike carried with it the weight of betrayal, humiliation, and sorrow. His breath came in sharp bursts, sweat quickly forming on his brow as he pounded the bag with a relentless fury. How could she do this? The thought seared through his mind, spurring him on. His punches grew faster, harder. Each one a futile attempt to expel the image of Lee and Larry together. The video's damning kiss replayed in his mind, fueling the fire in his chest. The sting of humiliation cut deeper than any physical pain. His arms began to ache, muscles straining under the force of his emotions. But he didn't stop. The bag swung wildly, responding to his relentless assault. The sound of his fists connecting with the thick canvas filled the basement, drowning out the silence. He shouted, mimicking her desperate cry from earlier on the lawn. His voice cracked, a mixture of anger and despair. He delivered a powerful uppercut to the bag, his entire body following through with the motion. It nearly knocked the bag off its chain, but still it wasn't enough. His punches became erratic, less controlled, as exhaustion started to creep in. His breath was ragged now, his vision blurred with sweat and tears he refused to acknowledge. Finally, after one last desperate strike, he collapsed to his knees, his forehead resting against the swaying bag. The room was quiet again, save for his heavy breathing. He stayed there for a long moment, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. Slowly, he reached out and steadied the bag, his hand trembling as it made contact. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, but he didn't care. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside. Eventually, he sank to the floor, leaning back against the cold basement wall. His chest heaved as he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with what came next. He was spent, both physically and emotionally, but the fire in his heart still smoldered, waiting for the next spark to reignite it. Marty sat quietly in the armchair in the living room, the afternoon sunlight filtering dimly through the curtains, casting a somber glow across the room. His mind churned with the chaos of the past few days. The doorbell rang, jolting him out of his stormy thoughts. When he opened the door, Milt and Ellen, Lee's parents, stood there with tense expressions. "Marty," Ellen began, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk." Milt nodded, following his wife into the living room. Marty didn't invite them to sit, but they chose seats on the couch anyway, a silent assertion that they weren't leaving until they said what they came to say. "Son," Milt said, his voice steady but strained, "I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But you need to think about the kids. I believe this isn't beyond repair." Marty crossed his arms, his gaze cold. "Repair? You think I can just forget what she did?" He turned his glare to Ellen. "The whole world saw it. The kids will find out. I can't pretend it didn't happen." Ellen leaned forward, her tone pleading. "Marty, we're not here to justify Lee's actions. She knows she made a mistake, but she still loves you and she needs you for the kids. Don't let one mistake destroy everything you've built together." "Mistake?" Marty scoffed bitterly. "You call that a mistake? 3 nights with that guy Larry, not even trying to hide it, and you want me to believe she still loves me?" The room grew heavy with silence, an unbreakable curtain of tension. Finally, Milt sighed. "Marty, you need time. Speak to a lawyer, think it through, but don't make decisions in the heat of anger." Marty stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he said coldly, "and I've never been more certain." He turned away, leaving them sitting there in helpless silence. Late at night, as Marty sat quietly in the kitchen, his phone buzzed on the table. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. Though reluctant, he answered. "Marty," Larry's voice came through, calm but laced with arrogance. "I want to apologize." Marty's grip tightened on the phone, his anger flaring instantly. "You think an apology will fix this?" he growled. Larry was silent for a moment before his tone sharpened. "I don't want things to escalate, Marty. But remember, this isn't all on me. Lee came to me." "Shut up," Marty shouted, his hand trembling. "You destroyed my family. Don't think for a second I'll let this slide." Larry's voice turned cold. "Listen, I'm not looking for trouble, but if you push this, it could come back to bite you. I have influence, Marty. You don't want to test me." The veiled threat was like gasoline on the fire of Marty's rage. He clenched his teeth, his voice dripping with defiance. "If I see you again, you'll wish you'd never come near my family." The girl reached out, prompts withdrawn now. Larry chuckled softly, the sound fueling Marty's fury further. "Careful, Marty. You don't want to do something you'll regret." "Listen here, Larry," Marty said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family. If you interfere again, I won't be responsible for what happens." The call ended in icy silence, but Marty remained seated, his hands trembling. Larry's threats didn't scare him. They only deepened his resolve. One thing was clear in Marty's mind. He would not let Larry or anyone else hurt his family further, no matter the cost. The golden hues of the sunset stretched across the quiet streets, casting a strange sense of tranquility. Marty was walking through the park, his mind tangled in a web of anger and pain. He needed space to think, to escape the suffocating emptiness of the house that now felt colder than ever. As he passed a corner of the park near the basketball court, a familiar sound caught his ear: the rhythmic thud of a basketball hitting the pavement. Marty looked up and saw Larry, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading sky. Dressed in a simple sports jersey, Larry was playing alone, moving effortlessly as if everything were fine. Marty froze, a wave of rage surging through him. His fists clenched, and the thought of confronting Larry flashed through his mind. But before he could make a decision, something unexpected happened. Larry lost control of the ball and it bounced off the court, rolling toward the street. From a distance, Marty watched as Larry jogged after the ball, his long strides casual and carefree, as if the world held no troubles for him. But then, from the corner of the street, a black SUV appeared, speeding too fast to stop. "Larry, watch out!" a voice shouted from somewhere, but it was too late. The sharp sound of the impact shattered the serene atmosphere. Larry's body was thrown into the air, flipping before landing heavily on the pavement. The SUV screeched to a halt, its tires skidding loudly on the asphalt. Marty felt his legs rooted to the spot. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The shouts, the roar of the engine, and the whisper of the wind blended into a muffled haze in his mind. He stepped closer, drawn by an invisible force, his eyes fixed on Larry's motionless figure sprawled across the road. The driver, an older man with a face etched in horror, stumbled out of the SUV, frantically dialing for emergency services. "I didn't see him," he kept repeating, his hands trembling. Marty stood a few steps away, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with an odd sense of relief he dared not admit. Larry, the man who had destroyed his life, was gone. There would be no more confrontations, no more excuses, no more threats. Ever. Yet that relief was incomplete. Despite his hatred for Larry, Marty was still human, and witnessing another man's death, even that of an enemy, was not easy. He stared at Larry's lifeless body, blood pooling on the pavement, and an overwhelming emptiness settled over him. Is this the end? Marty wondered, the words echoing in his mind. This ending brought no victory, no solace, only a deep void. As the distant wail of an ambulance approached, Marty took a step back, letting others move forward. He turned away from the scene, feeling as though he had just woken from a terrible dream. But deep inside, one truth stood out more clearly than ever. His life had been irreversibly changed, and there was no going back. The sky darkened, and with each step, Marty felt himself moving farther from his anger, yet closer to his solitude. From this point on, he knew he would face the future without revenge, without reconciliation, only with what remained of himself. The counseling room was small but cozy, bathed in the soft, warm glow of a table lamp, making the atmosphere feel gentler. Dr. Sylvia Price, a middle-aged counselor with sharp eyes and a soothing voice, sat across from Marty and Lee. Between them was a low table, yet the distance between Marty and Lee felt like an unbridgeable chasm. "Let's begin," Dr. Price said, her voice calm yet authoritative. "The goal today is to explore the reasons behind Lee's actions and to see if there's any common ground where trust can be rebuilt." Marty sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall. Lee, sitting next to him, fidgeted nervously, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt as if trying to steady herself. Dr. Price broke the silence, turning to Marty first. "Marty, what makes forgiveness feel impossible for you?" The simple question struck like a dagger to Marty's heart. He turned to Dr. Price, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I can't forgive her because it wasn't just betrayal. She destroyed the entire image I had of our family. I can't look at her without seeing..." His voice faltered as he bit back his words. Dr. Price nodded, her expression steady and encouraging. "Those feelings are completely natural, but have you considered that forgiveness might free you from the pain you're holding on to?" Marty let out a bitter laugh. "Forgiveness? I'll never feel free knowing she chose someone else, even for a moment. Forgiveness won't erase those images from my mind." Lee began to sob, her voice trembling. "Marty, I was wrong, but I never wanted to hurt you this much. I don't even know what I was thinking. Just what, Lee?" Marty snapped, his voice sharp. "Just wanted a few nights with Larry to see what it was like, and then come back pretending nothing happened?" Dr. Price raised a hand, her voice firm yet calm, cutting through the tension before it escalated further. "Let's slow down," she said. "Lee, you mentioned you didn't know why you acted that way. We need to understand that better. Can you tell us more about how you were feeling before it happened?" Lee took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I felt lost. I felt like I wasn't connected to Marty anymore. Work, everyday life, everything became routine. When I met Larry in Miami, I wasn't thinking. I just felt seen, wanted." Marty's fists tightened, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Lost? Why didn't you tell me? I'm your husband. I should have been the one you turned to, not him." Dr. Price stepped in, her gaze steady on Marty. "Can you explain why it's so important to you that Lee turned to you in that moment?" "Because that's what marriage is about," Marty replied, his voice shaking with anger. "When things get hard, we're supposed to lean on each other, but she didn't choose me." Dr. Price allowed the silence to linger for a few moments, letting Marty's words settle in the room. Then she asked, "If Lee is truly remorseful and willing to change, do you think there's a chance you could start over?" Rachel watched quietly for an answer. Marty lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. Part of him wanted to brush it all aside, to believe that starting over could heal everything. But the images of Lee in Larry's arms, their smiles, their kiss, each one sliced through him like a blade. "No," he finally said, his voice soft but resolute. "I can't. I don't trust her anymore. And no love can survive without trust." Lee broke into uncontrollable sobs, while Marty turned away, unwilling to look at her. Dr. Price took a deep breath and ended the session with a somber tone. "I think we need more time to confront these emotions. But remember, healing is only possible if both of you truly want it." Marty stood, nodded briefly, and left the room without looking back. Each step felt weighted, but inside, he knew he had made his decision. Forgiveness was not a path he could take, even if it meant walking forward in solitude. Marty stepped into the office of attorney Joan Ellis, clutching a folder filled with evidence of Lee's affair. His face was stoic, but his weary eyes betrayed sleepless nights and endless internal battles. Joan, an experienced lawyer, listened intently as Marty recounted his story. "What do you want out of this divorce?" Joan asked, her sharp eyes fixed on him. "Custody of my kids," Marty said without hesitation. "I want them to live with me, in their home. Lee can visit, but I don't want them dragged into the chaos she created." Joan nodded. "That can be pursued, especially if you've been the primary caregiver. But Lee has the right to fight for custody, and I need you to be prepared for that. We'll need to prove that you provide the most stable environment for your children." The discussion shifted to asset division. Joan pointed out that the house, which Marty had owned before the marriage, would likely remain his. However, shared savings accounts and other assets would need to be divided per the law. Marty agreed, uninterested in material possessions. His daughters were all that mattered. Over time, the divorce papers were finalized and submitted to court. While Marty remained resolute and detached, Lee hired her own lawyer to defend her interests. The legal battle unfolded under a cloud of tension. In court, Lee expressed her desire for shared custody, emphasizing her remorse and willingness to do whatever it took to make amends. Marty, on the other hand, argued for stability, highlighting the environment he had provided for the children throughout the turmoil. The judge required both parties to attend family counseling to determine the best outcome for the children. Marty reluctantly agreed, understanding the court's priority was the children's welfare, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect them. After weeks of deliberation and hearings, the judge awarded primary custody to Marty. Lee was granted visitation rights on weekends and during some holidays. It wasn't a complete victory, but for Marty it was enough to ensure his daughters could grow up in a stable environment. Lee sat quietly in her newly rented apartment. The small, tidy space was dimly lit by the faint light filtering through the window, casting a somber tone. The divorce papers lay on the table before her, a stark reminder of the mistakes she had made. Since the day Marty filed for divorce, Lee had lived in a near-robotic state. Guilt consumed her daily, haunting every moment. Images of Marty and their 2 daughters were constant in her mind, a painful reminder of what she had lost. "How did I let it come to this?" Lee whispered to herself, her eyes welling with tears. She had hurt the man she loved most and destroyed the family she once cherished. In court, as Marty explained his reasons for seeking custody, Lee couldn't fault him. Every word he said, no matter how cold, was true. She had put their family at risk, and she understood that Marty was only trying to protect their children. Still, Lee fought, not to win, but to prove to her daughters that she was still a loving mother and willing to make amends. But every effort she made only highlighted the gulf between her and Marty. He remained steadfast and logical, while she, despite her realization of her mistakes, couldn't escape the vulnerability that had led her to this point. When the judge delivered the final ruling, Lee felt her heart shatter. She knew she no longer had a say in her children's day-to-day lives. Her visits would now be limited, and she had to accept that they would grow up under Marty's care. Lee left the courthouse in silence, her eyes cast down. She didn't cry, but the emptiness in her chest threatened to engulf her. Back at her apartment, Lee opened her laptop and began writing a letter to her daughters. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she wanted them to know that she loved them and would never stop trying to be better. In each word, she poured her regret and her hope that, even a little, they might understand her heart. For Lee, life after the divorce became a long journey of self-discovery and redemption. She resolved to mend her mistakes, even though she knew that, in Marty's heart, some wounds would never heal. Marty pulled open the kitchen curtains, letting the early morning sunlight fill the quiet house. The clock read 6:30 a.m. and breakfast was already prepared for his 2 daughters, Betsy and Linda. The dining table, now set for just 3, felt incomplete, but Marty compensated with jokes, their favorite meals, and his steady presence. "Betsy, you have your science project due today, right?" he asked, placing a plate of sunny-side-up eggs in front of her. Betsy nodded sleepily, her eyes still half closed. Linda, sitting beside her, let out a long yawn. Both girls were trying to adjust to their new routine, but Marty knew it wasn't an easy transition. After breakfast, Marty drove them to school. The familiar route felt different without Lee in the passenger seat. A part of him still felt empty, as if he were operating on autopilot. But he refused to dwell on it for long. His responsibility to Betsy and Linda was his top priority. Back at home, Marty settled into his workspace, opening his laptop to continue his programming work. He had opted to work from home to be more available for the girls. Work kept his mind occupied, but the silence of the house sometimes brought back memories of his failed marriage. When those moments came, Marty turned to physical activity. The punching bag in the basement was his emotional outlet, though he now hit it with more control. Evening jogs around the neighborhood had also become a new habit, helping him clear his mind and focus on the positives. Occasionally, Lee called to talk to Betsy and Linda. Each call stirred mixed emotions in Marty. Relief that the girls still had their mother in their lives, but also a painful reminder of the past. Still, he kept those feelings in check. His main goal was to maintain stability for his daughters. Betsy and Linda sat in the living room of Lee's rented apartment, their expressions a mix of hesitation and anticipation. Lee, looking tired but forcing a smile, sat across from them, trying to start a natural conversation. "Did you have a good week at school?" Lee asked gently, her tone laced with nervousness. Linda, the more empathetic of the two, nodded and began sharing details about an art project she was working on. Lee listened intently, hanging on to every word as though trying to memorize every small detail of their lives. Betsy, however, remained distant. She answered her mother's questions briefly, avoiding eye contact. When Lee asked about her feelings, Betsy shrugged and replied coolly, "I'm fine. Dad takes great care of us." The words cut deep, but Lee didn't blame Betsy. She understood that trust wouldn't be easily rebuilt, especially after her actions. Each weekly visit was an opportunity to show she was trying to be a better mother. Linda, with her tender heart, often tried to ease the tension, She would tug at Betsy's hand when her sister seemed too aloof, or flash Lee a quiet smile to encourage her. But even with Linda, Lee sensed the distance that now existed between them. After each visit, when the girls returned to Marty, Lee would sit alone in her small apartment, replaying the day's moments in her mind. She thought about what she could have done better, her regrets over the family she had lost washing over her. Yet she knew she couldn't change the past. All she could do was keep trying, one day at a time, to show her daughters that she was still their mother, even if things were no longer the same. Over time, Marty began to see single life not only as a series of challenges, but also as an opportunity for self-discovery. He joined community events, played sports with new friends, and even tried cooking more complex dishes. Betsy gradually learned to accept the situation. She grew less distant with Lee, though she still maintained a cautious boundary. Linda, on the other hand, grew closer to both parents, becoming an emotional bridge between them. While life after divorce was fraught with difficulties and mixed emotions, both Marty and Lee realized that their children's happiness and stability were paramount. Through their ongoing efforts, they found a glimmer of hope, small but enough to keep them moving forward. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the golf course as Milt and his longtime friend Fred Cunningham wrapped up their game. Fred, with his salt and pepper hair and calm demeanor, walked slowly beside Milt, his gaze thoughtful as he looked at the quiet rows of trees in the distance. "Are you okay?" Fred asked, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence. Milt sighed, gripping his golf club tightly, as if it were the only thing holding him steady. "I'm not sure, Fred," he replied, his eyes following a lone leaf drifting slowly to the grass. "I did what I thought was right, but now—" Fred stopped walking and turned to face Milt. "You didn't do anything directly, Milt. It was a chain of events that led to the outcome. You can't keep blaming yourself." End of chapter 4. Milt looked up, his expression filled with anguish. "Not directly? Fred, I told you that Larry always played basketball on Saturday afternoons. I knew what you'd do with that information, and I still told you. I knew you'd try to scare him. And now? Now he's dead." Fred placed a firm hand on Milt's shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and shared responsibility. "Yes, I honked the horn to startle him. But Milt, I couldn't control what happened next. He ran into the street without looking. The SUV did the rest." "It was an accident." "An accident?" Milt repeated bitterly. "We created the circumstances that led to that accident. If I hadn't told you, if I hadn't silently encouraged this, Larry might still be alive." Fred studied him carefully, his sharp eyes unwavering. "So you regret it, Milt? You wish he were alive to keep ruining Marty's family? To push him further into despair? Do you think you did this out of revenge for Marty? No, you did it to protect your granddaughters, to protect your family." Milt turned away, his steps slow on the grass, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his actions. In his mind, the memories of that fateful day played vividly. He recalled the anxiety when Fred agreed to his plan, the honk of the car horn, the sharp, sickening sound of the collision, and Larry's body lying motionless on the asphalt. "God, what have I done?" Milt thought, his steps dragging. "I just wanted it to end. I wanted to protect Marty, to protect my granddaughters. But was this the only way? Was there really no other choice?" He remembered Marty's eyes when he heard about Larry's death. There was no joy of victory or sense of peace, only the hollow gaze of a man pushed to the edge, left with nothing but emptiness. Fred broke the silence again. "You might think you're a bad person, Milt, but if we hadn't acted, Marty might have destroyed himself. Don't you see? Sometimes doing what's right doesn't mean doing what's good." Milt remained silent, his hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Fred was right. Larry was a threat, not just to Marty, but to his entire family. Yet that logic did little to soothe the ache in his heart. Finally, Milt raised his head, his expression resolute. "Fred, I'll carry this with me for the rest of my life. Maybe you're right, but that doesn't make it any easier for me." Fred nodded, as if he understood. "That's the price we pay, Milt, but you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'll shoulder my share of the responsibility." They resumed walking across the golf course, neither saying another word. Both men knew the burden would forever weigh on their minds. But for Milt, the only thing allowing him to move forward was the thought that, In some way, he had protected Marty's family from an even greater tragedy. Still, deep down, one question lingered. What if I was wrong? Reads Perth. On a serene morning, Marty sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming softly through the curtains, giving the house a warm, comforting glow. In front of him, a steaming cup of coffee rested next to a half-folded newspaper. From the living room, the cheerful laughter of Betsy and Linda echoed as they watched a television show together. These ordinary sounds, once taken for granted, were now treasures Marty deeply appreciated. Life after the divorce had been far from easy, but Marty had gradually established a new rhythm. He continued working from home, joined evening runs, and occasionally played ping pong with a few old friends. The rare dates he attended were casual and non-committal. Still, he didn't allow himself to go further, partly out of fear and partly because his focus remained firmly on his daughters. Betsy, while still retaining her characteristic stubbornness, had begun to open up more to both her parents. Linda, the family's peacemaker, worked tirelessly to maintain harmony. Marty felt a swell of pride seeing his daughters grow, yet he understood that the scars in their hearts, though hidden, would take time to heal. In the quiet evenings, when the house settled into stillness, Marty often sat alone in his armchair, gazing at an old family photo on the bookshelf. The picture was a reminder of a once happy time, now just a memory. Yet, instead of pain, it brought him a peculiar sense of peace. Despite all the changes, Marty knew that he and his daughters were moving in the right direction, step by step. As Marty reflected on his journey, one question lingered in his mind. Does forgiveness truly heal? He had chosen not to forgive, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Trust, once shattered, is not easily rebuilt. But had this decision anchored him to the shadows of the past? For Lee, the question was equally haunting. Could she ever repair what had been lost? Her love for her children and Marty was genuine, yet it had been overshadowed by her poor choices. She had tried to reconnect with her daughters, to prove she was still worthy of being their mother. But deep down, she knew it would never be enough to erase what had happened. To the reader, the story leaves a question as a point of reflection. Can we overcome betrayal? Is forgiveness the only path to healing, or is letting go sometimes the most necessary choice? The reader knows whatever thoughts he surrounds himself with are drifting thoughts floating through his head. Whatever the answer, Marty and Lee's story serves as a testament to resilience. Even when life knocked them down, they kept moving forward, slowly but steadily, toward a future where hope might still be waiting.